The champagne in her glass had gone flat an hour ago, but Evelyn kept her fingers wrapped around the stem anyway, something to hold on to in a room full of people who weren't looking at her. Not yet. The ballroom smelled like lilies and old money, chandelier light scattering gold across the marble, violins playing something slow and expensive. She didn't belong here, not really. Tucked into the corner by the window in a black dress she'd bought 2 sizes up from the last one she owned, the fabric loose enough to hide what she still wasn't ready to explain to anyone. Her feet ached in shoes she hadn't broken in. Her locket sat warm against her collarbone, the one thing on her body that still felt like hers. She kept touching it without meaning to, a habit now, 3 months deep, ever since the night everything changed and she'd told no one. She almost hadn't come. Bella had talked her into it over the phone 2 nights before, some line about how hiding in an apartment for the rest of her life wasn't a plan, it was just a slower way of disappearing. Standing here now, watching 100 strangers laugh at jokes she wasn't part of, Evelyn wasn't sure her friend had been right. Evelyn? The voice cut straight through the noise. She knew it before she turned around. Would have known it in a crowd of 1,000. Ryan Whitaker stood there in a suit that fit too well, a drink in his hand he hadn't earned the money for, his eyes already moving over her the way they used to at the end, assessing, cataloging, deciding what to say next before he'd even finished looking. Wow. He said it slow, like he was savoring it. I almost didn't recognize you. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't seen him since the night she'd walked out with 2 suitcases and nothing else. She hadn't wanted to see him tonight either. She'd checked the guest list twice. Ryan, her voice came out steadier than she felt. That alone was something. His gaze dropped, slow and deliberate, down the length of her. You've changed. I should get back to… No, seriously. He raised his voice, just slightly, just enough that a few heads nearby started to turn. Look at you. You got fat, Evelyn. 3 years I put up with you, and this is what you turned into? Somebody laughed, then another. A woman near the bar covered her mouth, not quite hiding her smile. Heat crawled up Evelyn's neck, into her ears. Her whole body wanted to bolt, every instinct in her screaming, leave, hide, disappear. The same pull she'd felt for 3 years every time Ryan decided to make her small in front of other people. She'd never once given into it. She didn't now either. Her hand found the locket at her throat and held on. That's the thing about cruelty like this. It only works with an audience. Alone, it's just ugly words from an ugly man. In a room full of people, it becomes a performance, and the woman on the receiving end only gets 2 choices: fall apart or refuse to. She refused. A champagne glass hit the marble floor and shattered. The laughter died on the spot. Footsteps crossed the room, unhurried, heavy, the kind that didn't need to rush because nothing here was going to stop them. Security stepped back without being told. A CEO near the stage lowered his head. A senator half rose from his chair and thought better of standing all the way up. The quartet stopped mid-note, and for one suspended second the only sound in the ballroom was a fork someone forgot to set down quietly. Lucian Harrington walked in wearing charcoal and a stillness more dangerous than anything Ryan had just said. He didn't glance at the crowd. He didn't need to. The whole room adjusted around him like water around a dropped stone. His eyes swept the space once, gray, unreadable, ice over something colder underneath, and stopped on Evelyn. Not with pity, with something closer to reverence, like he'd been looking for her specifically and had just found her. Her hands were shaking so badly the locket slipped, hit the floor, sprang open. A folded note skidded out across the marble and stopped an inch from his shoe. I have known for 3 months. Lucian bent down, picked it up, read it. Something flickered across his jaw, tight, controlled, before he closed his hand around it and knelt to press it back into hers. When he leaned in, his voice was pitched low enough that only she could hear it. "Your chamomile's getting cold, Evelyn." Ryan's face went the color of paper. Nobody in that ballroom understood what they'd just watched. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't charity. It was a woman who'd been made invisible for 3 years, suddenly standing beside the one man this entire city was afraid of, and every person who'd laughed 30 seconds earlier was doing frantic, silent math about how badly they'd misjudged the room. Underneath all of it sat a question nobody in that room could answer. How did Lucian Harrington know her favorite tea? How did he know about a pregnancy she hadn't told a single living soul about, when the two of them had never met before tonight? He pressed a handkerchief into her palm, the Harrington crest stitched into the corner, still warm from his pocket, and walked away without another word. The silence held so long that when the quartet finally started playing again, it sounded almost like an apology. If you were Evelyn, would you have stayed quiet in that moment, or torn into Ryan in front of the entire room? Tell us in the comments. Because what happens next is about to change everything you think you understand about who actually holds the power here. By day, Evelyn was nobody, a data analyst tucked into a back office at a small Manhattan gallery, exactly where nobody thought to look for her. The office smelled like old paper and the burnt coffee from the machine down the hall that nobody ever cleaned properly. A single window looked out onto a brick air shaft, letting in a thin gray light that made the hours blur together. She liked it that way, the smallness of it, the predictability. 3 years with Ryan had taught her that being invisible beat being seen. She hadn't slept much since the gala. She kept replaying it, not the humiliation, oddly, but the 10 seconds after. The way the room had gone quiet. The way Lucian's hand had felt briefly against her shoulder, warm even through the fabric of her dress. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She told herself that every morning on the walk to work, and every morning she believed it a little less. At night, lying awake, she found herself touching the spot on her shoulder where his hand had rested, as if the warmth might still somehow be there. What she didn't know, Lucian had been watching her long before that gala. Weeks before, he'd seen her quietly cover a gap in pay for an employee who'd just gotten fired, sliding cash into an envelope and leaving it in the woman's coat pocket without ever mentioning it to anyone. No fanfare, no one asking her to. He'd stood in the doorway of the break room, unnoticed, and watched her do it, something in his chest going quiet and sharp all at once, the way a man notices when a puzzle piece slides into place after searching too long for the picture. He didn't stop because of her face. He stopped because of that. People show you exactly who they are the moment they think nobody's looking. Lucian had built an empire reading those moments. Evelyn had passed the test she didn't even know she was taking. Bella Reyes was the only one who really knew her, best friend since their first week at the gallery, back when they were both terrified of the head curator and bonded over shared exasperation in the break room. Coffee, the morning after the gala, in the little diner 2 blocks from the office with the sticky vinyl booths and a jukebox that hadn't worked in years. Bella grabbed her hand across the table, nearly knocking over her mug in the process, coffee sloshing dangerously close to the rim. 3 years, Bella said, her voice low and fierce, leaning so far across the table her elbow nearly landed in the sugar packets. 3 years making yourself small for a man who never deserved the effort. Whoever that guy was last night, he saw what I've been telling you for months. You were never invisible, Eve. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like it might anchor her, feeling the heat seep into her cold fingers. I don't even know him, Belle. He looked at me like... She stopped, shook her head, staring down at the cracked laminate of the table. It doesn't matter. It was probably nothing. Bella's eyebrows went up so fast Evelyn almost laughed despite herself. That was not nothing. I've never seen a room go that quiet in my life. Honey, the senator sat back down like his knees gave out. They sat there a while longer, the diner filling slowly with the lunchtime crowd, and Evelyn found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, actually eating her whole breakfast instead of picking at it and pretending she wasn't hungry. Then the message came, 3 days later, while Evelyn was eating a sad desk lunch of crackers and hummus, the fluorescent light overhead buzzing faintly the way it always did in the afternoons. Anonymous, an account number, $50 million, her name on it. She read it twice, then a third time, her stomach twisting, certain it had to be some kind of scam, some cruel extension of the gala's humiliation. She almost deleted it. Her thumb hovered over the screen for a full 10 seconds before she set the phone down entirely, as if putting distance between herself and it might make it less real. She opened the locket with shaking hands instead, some instinct pulling her toward it. A second note, one she hadn't put there, folded so small it had been easy to miss, tucked into a crease she hadn't even known existed. You were never invisible. She sat at her desk for a long time after that, the hum of the gallery's ancient air conditioning the only sound, staring at the note like it might rearrange itself into something that made sense. Somewhere down the hall she could hear the muffled ring of the gallery's front desk phone going unanswered, and it struck her, absurdly, that the whole ordinary world was still turning while hers had just tilted sideways. That night, a black car waited outside her building, engine idling low, headlights cutting soft cones through the evening fog that had settled over the street. She almost turned around twice before getting in, her hand actually closing around the door handle once and letting go, some old instinct telling her to run back inside and pretend she'd never seen the car at all. Lucian, inside, chamomile already steeping on the console, the small paper tag from the tea bag still hanging over the rim of the cup like he'd made it seconds before she arrived. "You remembered," she said, sliding in, the leather seat cool beneath her, the door closing behind her with a soft, expensive click that somehow felt final. "I remember what matters." He reached forward, blocked the dash cam without ceremony, the gesture so practiced it barely registered as suspicious. "Ryan owes Damien Cross money. He's laundering it through your gallery's shipping invoices." Her breath caught. The city lights slid past the window in long, amber streaks, blurring at the edges the way they do when you're not really seeing them anymore. I would have seen that. I do the books. I know every line of those invoices." "You would have," he said, "if someone hadn't made sure you didn't." Something unfamiliar settled in her chest, not shame for once. Somebody had looked at her and seen a person worth protecting, not a body worth mocking. She studied his profile in the dim light of the car, the sharp line of his jaw, the scar along it that caught the passing streetlights, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, what it would feel like to be looked at like that every day instead of laughed at. She caught herself staring and looked away first, her pulse doing something strange and unfamiliar in her throat. What she didn't know yet. Lucian's own security footage showed him quietly bringing in a private doctor after she'd fainted at work once, months back. A spell of dizziness she'd chalked up to skipping breakfast, sworn to silence, months before she told anyone she was pregnant. He'd known before she'd fully let herself believe it, had stood outside the exam room that day with his hands in his pockets, waiting for a report he had no right to be waiting for. The relief didn't last. Late one night, buried in old shipping files, the office empty except for the buzz of the overhead fluorescents and the distant hum of traffic outside, she found her own signature, forged, on an invoice for smuggled antiquities. Her hands went cold. She read the date twice. She hadn't even been in the building that day. She remembered it specifically because it was the day she'd taken off for a dentist appointment she'd been dreading for weeks. A voice, behind her, in the empty office, close enough that she felt her whole body go rigid before she turned. "Ms. Caldwell, you know what the sentence is for trafficking antiquities?" Victor Lang, smiling too calmly for those words, his hands folded in front of him like he was discussing the weather, his shoes making no sound at all on the office carpet, as if he'd been standing there for longer than she wanted to think about. Her mouth went dry. Every hair on her arm stood up. She didn't answer. She just started pulling every email he'd ever sent her the second he left the room, her hands trembling as she typed, lining up the inconsistencies with the same cold precision she used on the gallery's books. Timestamps that didn't match. A shipping manifest altered 2 days after the fact. A signature block copied and pasted from an old contract, the pixels around her own name subtly, unmistakably wrong if you knew where to look. She did. Fear, with nowhere to go, sometimes turns into focus instead. She didn't panic in that office. She started counting. Counting was the one thing nobody could take from her. When she told Lucian, sitting across from him in a car again, this time parked outside her building at midnight, the engine ticking as it cooled, he didn't blink. He didn't reach for his phone to make calls or promise vague retribution. He just listened, all the way through, his eyes never leaving her face. And then he handed her full access to the Harrington family's backup ledger, a set of encrypted files she'd only heard whispered about. Trust almost no one in his world ever got. "Why me?" she asked quietly, the question slipping out before she could stop it. "Because you're the only person in this whole mess who hasn't lied to me yet," he said, and something in the flatness of his voice told her he meant it more than the words let on. Ryan hadn't just mocked her. He'd helped build a trap. Him, Damien, Victor. But now Evelyn was holding the keys that could bring the whole thing down, if she moved fast. And careful. The gallery's big annual auction. Collectors, money, cameras, the room dressed in white orchids and low gold light, waiters weaving through with trays of champagne nobody was really drinking, everyone too busy watching everyone else, the low murmur of 100 private conversations blending into one long hum beneath the string quartet. And, uninvited, Ryan Whitaker, walking in like he owned the floor, his shoes too loud against the polished concrete. He walked in with reporters already rolling and pointed straight at her, his voice pitched to carry over the crowd noise. "She's been stealing confidential files. I have proof. She belongs in a cell, not in this room." The room murmured, heads turning, phones lifting to record, a dozen little screens all pointed at Evelyn at once, like she was suddenly the only thing in the room worth looking at. The old shame started climbing up Evelyn's throat again, the same heat from the gala, the same instinct to shrink, her hands curling into fists at her sides, nails biting half-moons into her palms. Until Lucian stepped onto the stage, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. "I'm buying this gallery," he said, 3 times asking price. Silence again. That same silence that followed him everywhere, thick enough that Evelyn could hear her own pulse in her ears, could hear the faint creak of someone shifting their weight 3 rows back. He crossed the floor, hand resting at her waist, warm and steady, voice pitched for every microphone in the room. "She has no reason to steal anything. The entire Harrington estate belongs to her, and to our child." Gasps. A tray of champagne glasses nearly tipped in a waiter's shaking hands, one glass actually toppling and shattering somewhere near the back, the sound swallowed almost entirely by the noise of the crowd. Ryan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His face had gone the color of old paper, and for a moment he looked less like a man and more like something folding in on itself. Lucian opened the locket. The photo inside, Evelyn, alone, crying in a hospital room 3 months back, the night she found out, her face lit only by the harsh fluorescent light above the exam table, one hand pressed flat against her stomach in the picture, like she was trying to convince herself it was real. He turned to Ryan, and his voice dropped into something quieter and far more frightening than a shout. "While you were calling her fat, she was protecting a Harrington heir, alone. The man who walked out on her just signed off on his own career." Something cracked open in Evelyn's chest. Not pain this time. Relief, so sudden and total it nearly buckled her knees, a physical weight lifting off her shoulders so fast it left her almost dizzy. She stood up straighter than she had in years, feeling, for once, exactly how much she was worth. The room's stunned silence settling around her like something she'd earned rather than something she was hiding from. Somewhere in the crowd, she caught sight of a woman from the gala, the same one who'd covered her mouth laughing weeks ago, now staring at her with an expression that looked almost like shame. Public shame doesn't usually flip into vindication through the person who got hurt defending herself. It flips when somebody else says the truth out loud, in front of the same crowd that laughed the first time. That's the only reason Evelyn didn't need to raise her voice to feel powerful. Lucian just gave the room permission to finally see what had been true the whole time. Ryan was never really talking about her body. He was talking about control. And the second someone refused to buy into that, he had nothing left. Quietly, she stepped forward, her hand only slightly unsteady, and slid Lucian the folder of suspicious emails, evidence she'd dug up on her own, no one telling her to, printed and highlighted in her cramped, careful handwriting, the edges of the pages worn soft from how many times she'd gone over them alone at her desk. In front of everyone, Lucian tore up every deal his family had with Ryan's, the paper sound of it strangely loud in the hushed room, sharp and final as a gunshot. Ryan tried to say something, a stammered protest, half a sentence, his voice cracking halfway through, and nobody in the room even turned to listen. Reporters lowered their phones, no longer interested in a story that had already collapsed. That, Evelyn realized, watching him shrink in real time under the weight of 100 indifferent stares, was its own kind of ending. Worse than shouting, worse than tears, just nothing. The room simply stopped caring what he had to say. But Damien and Victor had built something much bigger than one nasty comment at a party, and Evelyn had just become the one person who could take the whole thing apart. Lucian walked her out of that hall while the crowd watched, no longer sure who exactly this woman was, her hand steady in his now, her chin lifted in a way it hadn't been in 3 long years. Outside, the cold night air hit her face, and she realized, only then, that her whole body had been shaking without her noticing. Days later, Victor's trap snapped shut tighter than anyone saw coming. Federal auditors froze part of the Harrington accounts, the news arriving in a single, terse phone call that made Lucian's face go still in a way Evelyn had never seen before. Not angry, exactly, but coiled, like something waiting to strike. For the first time, his own security team hesitated before following an order, glances passing between them in the hallway that made her stomach drop. The kind of look that said loyalty had suddenly become a question instead of a certainty. The penthouse felt different that night, colder, the lights dimmer, the usual quiet confidence in the air replaced by something tighter, more careful. Even the housekeeper moved through the rooms without her usual soft humming. Evelyn sat curled in the corner of the sofa, unable to sleep, a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, though the apartment wasn't cold, listening to Lucian's low voice on the phone in the next room, unable to make out the words, but able to hear the strain underneath them, the way his sentences got shorter and sharper the longer the call went on. Late that night, Evelyn caught Victor on a call through the cracked door of the study, his back to her, his voice dropping into something she almost didn't recognize. Old Sicilian, low and fast, the words tumbling out of him like something he'd been holding in for a long time. Traditore nella propria casa. A traitor in his own house. He didn't think anyone nearby would understand it. She did, from a grandmother long gone who used to mutter the same old phrases over Sunday dinners, her accent thick with the same rolling syllables. And it confirmed everything. Victor had orchestrated the humiliation at the gala from the start, hoping shame would push her away from Lucian before she ever found the fraud in the ledger. Her hands were shaking by the time she got back to her room, but not from fear this time. from the particular cold clarity of finally understanding exactly who the enemy was. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, staring at her own hands, willing them to stop trembling, and then, slowly, they did. She said nothing to him. Instead, she pulled up the $50 million account Lucian had given her weeks before, her fingers moving fast over the keyboard in the blue glow of the screen at 2 in the morning, the rest of the penthouse silent and dark around her, and realized, all at once, heart pounding, that it was the backup ledger. The pieces clicked together so fast it almost hurt, a physical jolt somewhere behind her ribs. Right there, in front of the whole syndicate the next morning, in a boardroom thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee, every eye in the room fixed on her, she ran the override. Unfroze everything. The room held its breath as the numbers on the screen shifted. A long, agonizing second where nothing happened at all, and then, all at once, exhaled, someone at the far end of the table actually laughing in relief. Lucian looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "You just saved my entire family." "You gave me the key," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, though her knees had gone slightly weak beneath the table. "I just used it." Betrayal from someone close rarely looks like betrayal while it's happening. It wears the mask of loyalty, concern, even affection. That's exactly why Victor almost got away with it. He understood something ugly and true. The fastest way to break a woman like Evelyn wasn't force. It was convincing her she didn't belong in the room at all. What he never counted on was that the same mind he wrote off as just an analyst was built entirely on refusing to look away from the details nobody else wanted to see. Her strength was never loud. It was patient, procedural, impossible to gaslight. And that made her the one person in that meeting he could never actually control. Fear turned into pride. Pride turned into something steadier. Trust. For the first time, she wasn't standing behind him. She was standing next to him, her shoulders squared, her voice carrying across a room full of men who had spent decades underestimating exactly her kind of quiet. She could feel Victor's eyes on her from across the table, and for the first time, she didn't look away from them either. Then Damien showed up on video, his face pixelated and smug on the boardroom's main screen, the connection glitching slightly every few seconds, trying to spin her as some gold digger who'd wormed her way into a fortune. She answered him herself, her voice flat and precise, walking the paper trail point by point until his own words hung him. Dates, transfers, a shipment manifest with his signature buried 3 pages deep, each detail landing like another nail. By the time she finished, his composure had cracked clean through, a muscle twitching at the corner of his mouth, and the call ended with him staring, silent, at a room that no longer believed a word out of his mouth. The syndicate elders who doubted her went quiet, watching her now with something that looked a lot like respect, a few even leaning forward slightly, as if reassessing everything they thought they knew about the woman standing beside Lucian Harrington. One of the oldest men at the table, silent the entire meeting, finally spoke, his voice gravelly with age. "Where did you find her?" he asked Lucian, and Lucian, for the first time all night, allowed himself something close to a smile. Lucian stood ready to face the whole council alone, if it came to that, but for the first time, it was clear he wouldn't have to. Victor built the whole thing from day one. Only one fight left, and it would decide everything. The child, the empire, all of it. Within a week, federal investigators opened formal cases against Ryan and Damien, almost entirely off evidence Evelyn had put together herself. Boxes of it, timestamps and signatures and shipping records, laid out with the same patient precision she'd once used just to balance a gallery's books. Both men's names started collapsing headline by headline, the kind of slow public unraveling that no amount of money could stop, their names appearing in smaller and smaller print with each passing day, until they disappeared from the news cycle entirely, replaced by newer scandals belonging to other people. Victor's part in the gala humiliation came out in the same investigation. Buried in records Evelyn had already quietly pulled together weeks earlier, back when she was still terrified of him, back when she used to flinch every time she heard his footsteps in the hallway. She didn't flinch anymore. At the family council, the room heavy with old wood and older money, the air thick with the smell of leather and cigar smoke that had settled into the walls decades ago, Evelyn walked in beside Lucian and laid out the whole chain, transaction by transaction, her voice never wavering, even as she felt the weight of a dozen skeptical eyes on her, some of them openly hostile at first. One by one, the old men at that table stood, bowed their heads. It was such a small gesture, and it undid her more than any applause could have. She had to look down at her hands for a moment to keep her composure. "She holds the financial future of this family now," Lucian told them, and signed over 49%. No hesitation, his pen scratching against paper in a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the faint tick of a grandfather clock somewhere in the corner of the room. He walked away from a massive contract without blinking, just to keep her and their child out of the blast radius. And when she tried to protest, to tell him it wasn't necessary, he only shook his head once, like the matter had never been up for debate, his hand finding hers under the table in a gesture so small nobody else in the room noticed it. "I'm not someone people get to look down on anymore," Evelyn said quietly to the room. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, but every person in that room heard it, and for the first time in her life, she meant it, all the way through, down to the bone. She felt the words settle into her chest like something finally coming to rest after a long time in motion. Self-worth almost never lands in one big dramatic moment. It's smaller than that. A trusted account. A hard truth said out loud. A room that finally listens. Enough small proofs stacked up that one day the old insult just doesn't fit anymore. Doesn't have anywhere left to land. Lucian took her hand, right there in front of the whole council, his grip warm and certain. "She's not beneath me," he said. "She's equal to me, in everything that matters." That night, back in the quiet of the penthouse, the city lights spread out below the windows like something spilled and glittering. He gave her back the locket. Behind the hospital photo, a flash drive, the same evidence once used to threaten her, now sealed proof she'd done nothing wrong. She held it in her palm for a long moment, feeling the small, cool weight of it, before closing her fingers around it like she never intended to let go, her thumb running once over the smooth edge of it, and for the first time since that night in the ballroom, she let herself cry without the old shame attached to it. Just relief, clean and simple. The woman they'd laughed at for her body now held the future of an empire in her hands. Bella, at the back of the room during the council meeting, hadn't even been able to stay for the whole thing without excusing herself to the hallway, where she cried without trying to hide it, one hand pressed over her mouth, overwhelmed with something like pride, already composing in her head the story she'd tell everyone back at the gallery on Monday. That night, penthouse balcony, Manhattan, spread out beneath them in 1,000 scattered lights, the air cool and smelling faintly of rain that hadn't quite arrived yet, a soft wind pulling at the hem of Evelyn's robe. Somewhere far below, the sound of the city hummed on, oblivious, the way it always did. Lucian knelt, kissed her stomach, his hands resting gently on either side of her hips, looked up at her like she was something sacred. Evelyn smiled, steady, sure, for the first time and longer than she could remember. She reached down and brushed her fingers through his hair. The gesture, so easy and unguarded, it startled her a little. How natural it felt after everything. How far away the ballroom and its cruel laughter suddenly seemed, like something that had happened to a different woman entirely. He fastened the locket back around her neck, his fingers lingering at the clasp, brushing lightly against the back of her neck. This time it clicked open somewhere new, A second, hidden compartment she'd never noticed, tucked beneath the first. A small brass key inside, worn smooth with age, the metal cool against her palm. "My father left this," he said quietly, "for whoever became his daughter-in-law. A house in Milan. It's yours." Behind it, a faded photo, a family she'd never met, standing in front of a stone villa she couldn't yet picture herself inside of, and now belonged to completely, their faces frozen in some long-ago summer she'd never been part of, and somehow already felt tied to. The syndicate that once doubted her spoke her name with respect now, and somewhere across the city, Bella was already telling everyone at the gallery she'd known all along Eve was meant for more, embellishing the story a little more with every retelling, the details growing more dramatic each time, until Evelyn, when she eventually heard the version secondhand, would laugh out loud at how unrecognizable it had become. Evelyn rested a hand on her stomach, feeling the faint, impossible flutter of movement beneath her palm. Whispered something to the baby, a promise, low and private, meant for no one else. Everything she'd wished somebody had told her, years ago, back when she still believed the worst things people said about her, back when a stranger's laughter in a crowded room could still make her feel like she was disappearing. She looked out at the city one more time, feeling the wind on her face, feeling Lucian's hand find hers on the railing. And for the first time in 3 years, she didn't brace herself for what came next. She simply let herself stay in the moment, unguarded, whole. This story reminds us that people don't get to decide your worth just because they're loud about it. Quiet strength hides in the ones everybody overlooks. She didn't become the foundation of an empire because a powerful man chose her. She became it because she never stopped being exactly who she always was, capable, loyal, strong, long before anyone bothered to notice. Tell us what you thought of Evelyn's transformation in the comments. Like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe for more.